Support for No Easy Answers comes from listeners like you. If you would like to help us continue doing what we do, please head to anchor.fm/No Easy Answers and click the support button. Every little bit helps, and we thank you for your continued support. Here is episode 6 in its entirety.
My core goal of advancing the revolution and contributing to the overthrow of the United States and U.S. capitalism, so that these injustices won't plague our society anymore, and so that the world can be saved from U.S. imperialism.
Today is Saturday, October 10th. The year is 2020. This is No Easy Answers, and I am your host, Jules Taylor. Today, like all days, I have no easy answers for you. So today on the show, I'm talking with Shea, and Rainer is a friend and a comrade I've gotten to know over Facebook and Twitter. He's a writer, he's a podcaster, and he's a revolutionary socialist. We're talking about anti-imperialism, and the reason I feel this is a conversation worthy of having in this historical moment is because I think many Americans are feeling like we're witnessing the decline of the American empire. Things are really bad right now in the United States, both domestically and on the world stage, as we lose favor and respect among our geopolitical allies and hemorrhage credibility. America's standing in the world is on a steady decline. The world order established at the end of World War II, with the United States being the premier military power and strongest economy, is largely dissipated. Although the military budget is still roughly 3 times the size of the Chinese military budget, our country has found itself unable to contend with any other obstacles other than a foreign war. In fact, we are a country that's made its peace with being perpetually at war, and in so many ways, America's imperialism has come back to haunt us. The rise of the police state, the surveillance state, and the Patriot Act leave the American public in a panopticon. But the very people who feel they're trapped in this failing capitalist system know the American empire is wounded. It's overextended in its territories, it's occupied by wars abroad and multiple crises at home. So, with all this in our national conversations, I felt like Rainer, who makes anti-imperialism the central focus of his work, would be the perfect person to speak to about this. So, without further ado, here is my conversation with Rainer Shea. You know, the way that I envisioned this conversation going was I would just kind of come in and be like, yo, dude, like, given, before we jump into everything, given that there are so many simultaneous crises, you know, we have this sort of ongoing depression layered over with the health crisis, and then we have the social uprising and greater unrest that's happening. We have the election looming, and we have wildfires out on the West Coast where you are. So given all this that's going on, the humanist in me wants to start by asking you, like, how you and your mental health are doing surrounding all of this, because I know it's a difficult time for anyone to really do anything, to focus, to concentrate, to work, while also having this sort of, you know, with the number of dead Americans out there, there's like this sort of dark cloud of subtle grief. It may not be more subtle for folks that have direct experiences with it, but how are you doing? How are your family members doing, your loved ones, and all of that?
I have a very stable life. I'm relatively not financially well off, but it could be a lot worse for me. It could be a lot worse for me. And my career has definitely helped me become both more financially and more mentally capable of functioning in the kind of country that we've become. So I'm living a pretty peaceful life, and I So I don't really have any crises in my life. Thankfully, no one I know has died from it, and really over the months, I've experienced this crisis in whatever forms I've that have affected me, like with the changing structure of school, with all the heightened political discourse, with all the heightened anxiety and the need to adjust to new health codes. As I've encountered these realities, I've had to adjust to them and to apply them to the mentality that I had adopted beforehand, the mentality of really stoically approaching the obstacles that I whatever obstacles I face, and overcoming them so that I can do my best to contribute to the revolution. So I'm trying to keep myself focused on my core goal of advancing the revolution and contributing to the overthrow of the United States and U.S. capitalism, so that these injustices won't plague our society anymore, and so that the world can be saved from U.S. imperialism.
Excellent, excellent. For the listeners that aren't familiar with your work and your activity online, I know that I came into contact with you maybe a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, but I saw your writings and comments on society and politics spread virally in a way. Like, you gained a lot of popularity very quickly from my short sort of from whenever I came into contact with you online. And I've always thought your work was very principled, very based in solid theory, like everything kind of logically checks out. And I think that maybe the reason why there's so many factions and disagreements on the left in general is because we spend a lot of time tracing our ideas to make sure that all of them are sort of logically consistent, as opposed to maybe the right, which doesn't do that and resultingly has a lot of incoherent ideology, I would say, but your journal is listed as an anti-imperialist journal. And so anti-imperialism, to me, in terms of theory, it makes sense to center that at the as a spearhead of our work, like anti-imperialism. And I was wondering if maybe you could go further into that as to why anti-imperialism is such a central topic for you to write on and focus your time on.
Because without focusing on anti-imperialism, anything that you try to do as a revolutionary will be incomplete. I mean, the United States itself is an empire, even before the United States started annexing all this territory around the turn of the 19th and 20th century. The U.S. was an imperialist power, centralized within the Washington regime. It might have been Pennsylvania at some point before then, but my point is the U.S. has always been an empire that's stolen and genocided and subjugated colonized peoples for the benefit of this aristocracy, the primarily white aristocracy, and for the benefit of the bourgeoisie. So if we discredit imperialism and the ideas that imperialism stems from, and the lies that imperialism uses to perpetuate itself, then we can strike at the core of this evil regime that's killing innocent people every day and keeping hundreds of millions in poverty, and that's destroying the planet.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I'm there with you on all of that, and I think most of my audience is I would say they're probably liberals, and there's some leftists, and as we further spread out, I think that the idea of the American empire falling, the idea of the end of the American experiment, seems, I mean, we call it revolutionary and other folks call it radical and would charge us with treason or something to that end. But I think there's plenty of historical truth if you can trace through history, like from the Cold War and the Vietnam War, the end of World War II. If you trace these lines, even back through like Manifest Destiny and the role of white supremacy and Christian supremacy, that Manifest Destiny played in the eradication of and genocide of Native peoples. I think there's plenty of historical truth to what you're getting at. If you trace through the lines of history, plenty of reasons why this American experiment, maybe it needs to end before the world itself can get to a better place.
Exactly. And I've been thinking about the end of the American Empire and what exactly this would mean, like in terms of the collapse that the United States is experiencing as an imperialist power. And I've come to the conclusion that I need to be realistic, like manage my expectations in how far the collapse goes in this era where U.S. hegemony is in decline. Even though U.S. hegemony is in decline, the United States is still able to function as a terrorist organization that occupies this continent and that's able to enact great violence against many countries, especially its Latin American neighbors. Like just last year, the U.S. Carried out another coup in Bolivia, and it might carry out a coup in this next week or so. It's the election there is getting tense, and the U.S.-backed paramilitaries are ready to move. So I think that without a revolution, the United States won't really disappear. It'll just evolve into a diminished but still genocidal and perhaps more fascistic than ever power that turns inward and that is capable of committing tremendous atrocities, like how Nazi Germany did after World War I, and how the fascists took over in Germany by scapegoating the Jews and by ramping up militarism with the purpose of invading the neighboring territories, and by consolidating the economy in a way that was able to preserve the floundering capitalist power structure. This is the function of fascism. So it's a cliche, but our choice is socialism or barbarism. And without a revolution that can actually overthrow the United States government, the U.S. won't disappear on its own. It'll just change into something it's hard to contemplate. I don't know if I want to contemplate the horrors.
Man, when you say be realistic with our expectations and approach things stoically, like I hesitate to want to ask you what you would think the U.S. looks like as it continues in its decline, or what the end of America might like. Because all of that is pure speculation, obviously, and it's hard to kind of imagine what tomorrow looks like, short of just thinking the worst thing possible is going to happen in a lot of folks' minds, But it's crazy how, the one thing that a lot of folks didn't bargain for with the rise of fascism in America is the sort of normalcy that continues. Like people are still going to work, rent is still due, kids still got to go to school, even though there's a pandemic. The normalcy that flows within the onset of fascism is something that I know I didn't think I didn't give any forethought to at all. And again, like most of my listeners here are not going to this is an interesting episode as we're talking about the end of America, man. And this is directly at odds with a lot of I did a show a while back about American idealism and this sort of purity of ideals that Americans are held to, with like free speech absolutism and the Second Amendment is a God-given right, and this sort of hard line of American bullshit that a lot of people follow, you know. So to the average Joe or the average American, I mean, I know we can point to all these different atrocities, but why should the average kind of liberal or maybe centrist American, why should they revolt, and why should they have sympathy towards like the end of the American experiment?
It depends on which path they want to choose, because many people within the United States, they kind of have a common interest with the capitalist class, and that much of the U.S. population directly or indirectly benefits from imperialism, and capitalism has been able to build up these social structures and businesses that put food on the table for a lot of people. And you know how capitalism perpetuates the illusion that it's the best possible system, that trying to scrap it would only result in something worse, that people should be grateful for what they have under capitalism. So for a lot of the upper middle class people, for a lot of the white people especially, I don't think we can trust them to join a revolution. We can give them the information, but a lot of them just won't join, and they might turn to the dark side and join the capitalist reaction. So I think that as revolutionaries, as members of communist organizations, we should try to reach out primarily to the people who have gotten the short end of the stick in the capitalist and colonialist project, to the colonized people, to Native and Black and brown people, and to the poorer communities, and because I'm always wondering who I should trust, who's going to stab me in the back as I try to proceed with this, who's going to sell me out. So it's rational paranoia.
Sure.
You're paranoid if people are really out to get you. So
anti-communism is everywhere. Yeah. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just mean to, like, when you talk about rational paranoia, I totally understand what you're saying. You know, there's even within leftist factions, there's rampant anti-communism, and there is the conflation of communism with fascism, with horseshoe theory, and sort of, you know, the Dinesh D'Souza's of the world, which seek to confuse people as far as history and rewrite it to blame the opposite of who you should be looking as historically accountable. So yeah, I mean, it's really difficult, and I get where you're coming from. We're just always wondering where, you know, who's going to stab you in the back, and that's all I wanted to say towards that. And you know, on the other side of that, like, you know, I going back to, I agree with you, man. There's the petty bourgeois, man. The petty bourgeois, like, there's a reason why these militias are holding $5,000 rifles, why these rifles or why these militias are pulling up to the Capitol buildings in like 2019 and 2020 Dodge Rams. You know, these are not folks who have gotten the short end of the stick, and these are primarily folks who have benefited from capitalism, imperialism, and just the everyday function of the way that capitalism reinforces itself. So to the guy that is convinced, right? Let's say he's not part of that group. He's gotten the short end of the stick, right? To that person who is not part of the petty bourgeois classes, maybe they're a minority, but generally feels unserved and not protected, and you know, that the system is out to harm them. So maybe they're protesting with like Black Lives Matter out in the streets or what have you. How would you, going back to anti-imperialism, like, how would you relate the struggle for anti-imperialism with the struggle for social justice at home? Like, how are those two things related, and why should one person in the thick of it domestically be concerned and ultimately take up the sword against our conflicts abroad?
It comes down to the reality that convinced me to become a communist, which is that as long as the United States exists, a truly just society will not exist. Capitalist democracy is not able to really serve the disenfranchised, not able to give them an equal voice with the privileged class. And from the way that our system functions, the furthest left or most progressive politicians that you can vote for are people like AOC, and AOC endlessly capitulates to the Democratic Party establishment. And these last two elections have shown that the U.S. electoral system and the Democratic Party can very easily rig the primaries against a candidate like Bernie Sanders, who is out of the neoliberal consensus.
Yeah,
and so electoral politics, taking the electoral approach within our settler colonial capitalist system, is not going to bring justice. And given this reality, a reality where the reactionary Republicans and white supremacists like Donald Trump can increasingly get successful through pretty easy voters disenfranchisement tactics, I think that the United States is just going to become a more hostile entity towards marginalized people, and it's things are going to get worse until the United States is overthrown, which is where you can get towards really radical ideas like emulating the tactics of Mao and Che Guevara, and well, if you want to see a current example of these kinds of the contradictions of capitalism and colonialism coming to a head and forcing marginalized people to act outside of electoral politics, look at Bolivia. Look at how even after a great plurality, at least, of voters in Bolivia support the socialist candidate, these institutions are working to disqualify the socialists and use violence if necessary to keep the fascists in power. And so, as soon as as this peaceful approach of electoralism is exhausted in Bolivia, the social movements will be ready to continue the protest, to continue to try to shut down the country, and to resort to armed struggle if necessary. And this could be where the United States ends up.
Yeah, there's a really interesting podcast by Robert Evans called "It Could Happen Here," and he speaks to kind of broadly illustrates what a civil war in reality would look like a second civil war. It's not just like a confederacy versus the Union. It's like several different factions and balkanization of different regions of the United States. So going to Bolivia, there was that Elon Musk tweet where he said, "We will coup anywhere we want." And that was, there was a lot of speculation around the Bolivian coup that was obviously like CIA orchestrated or something, that was it for the purpose of mining lithium, so we see this sort of resource extraction of capitalism happening, and as we know, capitalism can't stay home, right? So we're off bothering our Central American neighbors, our South American neighbors, and disallowing them from having peaceful democracies, purporting to be the spreader of freedom around the world, but really we're just fucking up other countries that really and denying them a right of national self-determination. So all that being said, so if Bolivia has a vote, if the country votes, there's still going to be this outside oppressor seeking to overturn or delegitimate that democratic outcome. So I totally I get where you're coming with all of that, man. So that being said, since we're talking about voting in Bolivia, I have to ask you, like, where do you stand on voting in the United States upcoming election? Because I'm always in the side with the people who are as equally fucked by both administrations. Like there are people who will not have any material conditions change whatsoever from either system. So I'm kind of over here thinking that, like, I'll do an absentee ballot for Biden as much as I want to hang my head on that while calling myself a communist, because I do really care about, like, you can't just, and I'm not trying to make a case for Biden. I'm just saying that there are very broad reasons that I think I could be sympathetic towards, like Biden wouldn't wake up in the morning and egg on the white supremacist militias of the world, and white supremacy in general. He wouldn't be fanning those flames at 8:00 with 10 tweets already in the morning. And two, in that Biden is, he has been maybe talking some of the talk about racial justice in the United States, but more than that, like, I think Biden would actually do something about 210,000 dead Americans from COVID. So very broad ideas from that. But if you don't mind me asking, like, where are you on this whole voting situation this year?
I fully endorse the campaign of the Marxist candidate Gloria La Riva of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. And I've been having some arguments, or I've been engaging in the debate over whether or not to vote for Biden. And, I'm reading the book Settlers by Jay Saki. And when I see Bob Avakian of the Revolutionary Communist Party tell his followers to vote for Biden, I see the kinds of historical phenomenons that Settlers describes, the phenomenons where the settler socialist movements resort to petty bourgeois reformism and capitulating to structures like the Democratic Party, and I'm just not having it. I think that to vote for Biden would strengthen the state, whereas there's a debate over whether or not anyone should vote. There are I've met some election boycott advocates, but I think that it's best to vote for La Riva.
Very cool. I had no idea there was a communist party actually with people on the ballot. So that's really cool. And I would, if you're listeners, if you're enjoying this conversation, I would highly encourage you to check out some of the policies of the candidates that Rainer mentions, just because it would, I just think that, like, any sort of introduction to policies that are radically egalitarian, which I hate even using the word radical to describe egalitarianism, but just any policies that you could be introduced to that are stated by communists, I find they're exceptionally good at kind of deprogramming any sort of crystallized anti-communism that folks may have, because it's not radical to say that we want, clean water, food, a clean environment, and right of national self-determination, and people having an equal shot at things. We're not talking about handouts. We're talking about equal shots at everything, and truly equal. There's this kind of, I don't know, maybe it was John Rawls, man, that said something about, like, it's about, like, if you had a pizza and somebody was in charge of cutting the pizza up, and that person who cut the pizza up didn't get to decide which slice they received, you would think that this person would cut up the pizza in slices that if they received any one of them, they would be happy to receive it. And that's kind of more along the lines of where you and I are coming from ultimately. And we're certainly not coming from a point of view where we're not advocating for, like, an underclass that is necessary to prop up the higher class. We're not advocating for a unfairly hierarchical sort of society by any means. So yeah, and it's funny, man, voting, dude. Voting is, in America, it's funny because we're so hyper individualistic. And then every 4 years, they try and corral you into some sort of collective of voting. Like we all have to do this. And it's really contradictory in my mind, and a little bit, it juxtaposed to our hyper individualistic American notion of how we lead our lives, and there is that argument to be made that, like, even by voting for Biden, you are still adding on to the harm. Like, you're not harm reducing at all, and so part of that, and what really makes me not want to vote at all, is understanding that we've been through 2 debates and they haven't mentioned the genocide of Central American and Mexican, South American children in this country. Like, when I say genocide, that's part of the UN's criteria of genocide is family separation that's happened, and they haven't kept track of, I think it was something like 5,500, which is probably more, kids in the United States. How is it that, I mean, speaking more towards like a psychological aspect, like, why do you think America is able to do things like the American public, like, how are they able to go this far with children being separated and not have that be a top of mind central political issue that's being sparred about in public? Like, how are 210 Americans dead and there have not been any sort of public grieving or any collective, like, what is it about the American psychosis or psychology or whatever you want to call it that makes us impervious to sort of mass death and suffering, maybe?
Yeah, well, this has been going on for since the beginning of the United States. During the Bush era, there were all these wars going on where hundreds of thousands were dying, and during the Clinton years, there were the Iraq sanctions that were killing. It might have been tens of thousands of people. And you can point to something from every year, every decade, and maybe every day of U.S. history where where genocide and injustice have been the norm. And this has been possible because of the the nature of how the United States was founded. One of my favorite quotes from settlers is that the ideology of white labor and the ideology of Americanism more broadly is what Sakai described as petty bourgeois annexationism, where the territories that the empire can take control of should be taken control of, because this will help increase the living standards of the beneficiaries of the empire, of the labor aristocracy, and to all the people within the empire who this wealth trickles down to. And there's lots of nuances to this, like the prevalence of censorship, how information about the atrocities the U.S. commits is concealed to the public, how propaganda distracts people, and how the nature of capitalist society, especially under neoliberalism, makes people politically fragmented, makes them kind of isolated from a communal structure and from a collective, so that they're a lot less likely to get out in the streets or to study theory or to pay close attention to the alternative news sites that are actually talking about these issues. So people so complicity is built into the system, and the only way to overcome it, I think, is if the contradictions of capitalism, imperialism, and colonialism get so pronounced, like through what we're experiencing right now with the pandemic and the economic crisis and the decline of U.S. power, and the climate crisis and all these intersecting crises, to the effect that living standards drastically decline and more people will be willing to step outside the norms of Americanism and join a resistance and get educated, so that we can overthrow the power structure and create a post-colonial, post-imperialist, post-capitalist, ultimately, society where the evil is no longer being perpetrated.
Excellent, man. Yeah, part of me struggles with like wondering what that post-capitalist, post-colonialism world looks like, because when we speak of like decolonization and the return of land, labor, resources, bread, and dignity, what does that actually look like, and I don't know exactly what that looks like, but I'm willing to fight for it, and it's important that, and I appreciate the sort of revolutionary optimism that you have as well towards remaining focused on your goal, navigating the uneasy terrain of living in America in 2020 in order to remain effective towards accomplishing what you set out to do. Maybe one or two more questions here, man. But so when we talked about South American coups and we talked about Venezuela for a second, I think we talked about Bolivia, I know, and you can correct me on this. Part of me is thinking didn't Venezuela successfully resist a coup recently by just arming the masses there?
Yes.
Was there, right? So when you talk about a Maoist sort of movement, I think what you're speaking towards, and again, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this. Obviously, it has to do with Mao, but more so on the side of guerrilla warfare, asymmetrical conflict. Yeah. And I've studied a bit of history, man. I look at places obviously World War II and Vietnam, and the thing that kind of links those two struggles, at least, is that either in Stalingrad during World War II, when the actual people of Russia took up arms in their homes and fought to defend their native land and successfully, kind of held the line against Nazi Germany, which was the most advanced army in the world at that time. And similarly, you had Vietnamese rice farmers who were learning Marx from Ho Chi Minh, who developed their own kind of style of guerrilla warfare to beat back French, Japanese, and American imperialism there. So when it comes to, I bring up Argentina and the arming of the masses and the successful resistance of a coup, because I look at America with all the guns that we have, and obviously there's more guns on the right than there are on the left, and but you wrote an article recently, and I wonder maybe you can talk about that, about how maybe resistance to the U.S. military by civilians within America, resisting them is not some far-fetched idea, and in very practical terms, it can be done.
Exactly. I've had to assess our options in terms of overthrowing the U.S. government, and I don't think that China is too likely to help us, since China's goal isn't to foment revolutions abroad, though Cuba and the DPRK are more likely to give us armed aid. And I also don't think that the majority of, or even the vast majority of military personnel, and certainly not police personnel in this country, will join the United States in a revolution. So we can't wait for some big windfall to save us. All we can do is build red bases, go in your community and build up your local communist organizations and get people involved, and with the security culture, of course, get more of them equipped with these tools for defense, and in not just in terms of guns, but in terms of medical ability to give medical attention and independent farming and all these, and also military intelligence, so that you'll be able to be capable of taking vast quantities of land. And of course, another thing you'll need to do in that case is try to consult the indigenous leadership within your area, so that you don't end up perpetuating colonialism. And what we're going to need to do if we're going to wage this kind of asymmetrical warfare against the United States is accomplish non-U.S. controlled zones they're different from Chaz. In that they'll have to be a whole lot bigger than Chaz, and they'll have to be led by a dedicated communist party, like a revolutionary vanguard, rather than kind of being really being open for leadership positions like Chaz was. And this led to Chaz getting dismantled and watered down by the liberal-minded people who started to integrate law enforcement and water down even the purpose of Chaz, and it was dismantled pretty quickly. So this is what we can learn from Chaz. If we're going to be serious about taking this territory from the U.S., we're going to have to think out every step of it and be able to prepare ourselves, equip ourselves to wage this kind of war of attrition. This is what we're trying to do, a war of attrition, where we're gradually wearing down the defenses of the enemy. And one thing about a potential civil war scenario in the United States is that if the U.S. government were to try to bomb large urban areas, like if they were to exercise too much of their firepower, then they would really be destroying their own country. They would be shrinking their own ability to exploit these areas for profits, and they'd be destroying their own infrastructure. So there's a potential advantage of ours.
Right.
And I look at the Afghanistan war and how a really militarily inferior army of the Taliban has been able to hold off so much of the country from the United States, and they've done this by winning over the local populations, and they've had a good case to make. No communist is pro-Taliban, but they've had a good case to make with telling these people about how the U.S. has filled their country with corruption and violence, with this almost 20-year military occupation, and how they need to resist the United States. So this is this is the kind of equivalent message we should focus on, telling people about, pointing out these contradictions within capitalism and colonialism, and winning people over to the idea of creating a zone that's not controlled by the United States, because the United States is an increasingly tyrannical regime that's not taking care of the vast majority of the people already. I mean, it's incredible how much inequality has been increasing in the last year alone. Since 2019, hunger in the U.S. has tripled, and children in the U.S. are 14 times more likely than a year ago to not have enough access to food. This is the kind of unacceptable. These are the kinds of unacceptable conditions that could win people over to the idea of militantly resisting the U.S.
Yeah, man. Yeah, I mean, I think it was Michael Parente who said, the revolution that feeds the starving children gets my support, and the revolution which doesn't feed starving children gets my or the system that doesn't feed starving children gets my undying contempt, or something to that end. And I'm right there with you on all this stuff, man. And so I guess there is an argument to be made on behalf of maybe accelerationists at this point, that think that the revolution gets closer the more heightened the contradictions of capitalism are. Would you make an argument for accelerationism, or because I saw, or I listened to an opinion recently that was the head of a different social justice group, and I won't say what, but he basically said, like, right now the U.S. is kind of fighting, and its internal contradictions are coming to a head, and that's not our fight. Maybe the best thing is to stand by and just let this attrition happen on its own by the natural contradictions of capitalism kind of eating itself, So I can kind of see both sides. But what would you say about someone who would be in favor of accelerationism, or working towards bringing these contradictions to a head? Is that like a worthwhile endeavor towards a revolution, or would you discourage that sort of thing?
Well, I don't know how we could really bring forward the capitalist accelerationism as people who lack direct political power. Like what are we gonna do?
Right. Like short of insurrectionalism, yeah.
Because all we can really do is sit back and observe the ways that these conditions are going to change. I mean, what are we going to do? Try to vote for Trump as communist to try to speed up the collapse of the United States? So
I've seen that argument made online. It's fucking crazy to me, but yeah.
Yeah. So rather than this is why I don't know how much it matters, the debate, acceleration versus non-accelerationism. All that we can do is build up our institutions that will be capable of springing into action when the conditions become right for revolt. And if we don't build up these institutions, if we don't make ourselves stronger, then all that will happen as the acceleration process continues is more necropolitics, more evils that proliferate. I look at Gaza, and Gaza is the logical conclusion of these genocidal capitalist and colonialist policies. It's a situation where almost 2 million people, I think, they're mostly below the poverty line. So many of them lack access to food and water, and they're perpetually having war waged against them by this extremely militarized, fascistic state. And this is the kind of thing that the United States will put the marginalized communities in this country under, a situation where they're partitioned off from the more privileged zones, and where they're subject to intensive surveillance and a militarized police state that perpetuates constant violence against the poor and especially against people of color, and where it could get really dystopian as the accelerationism continues. And this is how the capitalist structure can survive whatever crisis is thrown at it. With the absence of a revolutionary movement, the only thing that these crises will do is put the marginalized in an even worse position.
Right. And above all, we're trying to do no harm. We're trying to, make better the material conditions, not necessarily force the suffering to suffer more until the point of a revolution. That's not the point of it. And so I totally get what you're saying there. And yeah, you're right. I mean, as it's like pretty much like the world's largest outdoor prison at this point is kind of what Gaza has turned into. And I've never thought of that as kind of an example of what contradictions of capital taken to their furthest height kind of would result in, and what that would look like, and maybe what we see is sort of this fascistic decay around the United States, and occasionally we have these sort of symptoms of what we kind of allude to in Gaza, and like the concentration camps here in the United States, concentration camps of the 1940s for, Japanese folks during World War II, maybe even Guantanamo as another example of sort of how, capitalism pushed to its furthest ends looks like a militarized police state of, constant violence and subjugation. So that's a really interesting premise, man. So yeah, all right. So I guess that's kind of it for today, man. I do you have any sort of where can folks find you, and where can they read your stuff, and what, if any, links would you like to send them to further their education? And do you have any thing else that you're working on right now that you'd want to share with us?
Oh, you can find my website. Type in RainerShea.com, RainerShea.com. And you can find me on Medium. You can find me on Twitter just by typing in my name. And as for my more long-term projects, I'm writing a novel called Comrade Desmore. I hope to get it out sometime next year, and it's about all the things that we've been discussing, the capitalist accelerationism, and it's about a series of people who live within the imperial core, who live within the United States, and who are seeing their society change for the worse in the years between 2017 and 2021. And they all have to figure out what they're going to do in this changing society, how they're going to survive, or perhaps more importantly, how they're going to do the right thing.
Wow. So when do you think that's going to be out, man?
I don't know. I
say that I've never written a novel, but I'm sure it's a process which has a deadline, which kind of gets set back further the more you work on it at times. It's a difficult thing. Yeah. So I applaud you for that.
Yeah, probably sometime next year. I add a little bit more to the second draft of it, the version of it that's on the computer every day. So probably sometime next year, I'm going to be able to publish some serialized chapters that on my website that include the whole novel. And I'm not writing it to make money so much as to get people to read it.
Cool, man. Well, that sounds awesome. I look forward to your book. And Rainer, it's been awesome talking to you. I've wanted to talk to you for a long time. It was it's just super cool to talk to another person who says the quiet things out loud in a way. It's like we're talking about the end of America here, and it's hard to find someone who would be willing to speak openly about that. And I'm thank you for your candor and your wisdom. And I want to have you back on the show. Maybe the contradictions of capital are going to double like Moore's law, so it's I'm sure we'll have plenty more to talk about, especially as we get into 2021 and stuff like that. But thank you so much, brother. I appreciate it.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, and you're welcome.
Thanks for listening to No Easy Answers. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, criticism, or vitriol, you can send that directly to noeasyanswers@gmail.com. If you would like to be a guest on the show or know someone we should have a conversation with, let us know. And as always, you can follow us on social media. Be sure to like, subscribe, tell your friends, and share our stuff. Until next time, all my guys, gals, and non-binary pals, we love you. See you later. Bye.